Good evening, everyone. We'll talk about my shoes later. Thank you very much for coming out this evening, virtual audience. Thank you for joining us. This is really a special occasion because this is the 20th Billy Boyle book written by James R. Benn, and we have been together through the entire 20.
Yes, we have.
I know. So I can hardly believe that we've actually arrived at this landmark number.
Me too.
Right. And so a question always was, how fast were you going to move your way through World War II with Billy? Because we started with Denmark, the Royal Court of Denmark and other things, moving in Billy Boyle down to London to escape the Nazi invasion. And you have taken us to theaters all over the Nazi conflict, and once to the South Pacific, just once, right? Have you kept running into places and ideas that you didn't expect when you started out?
I had no idea it was going to be 20 books and more because I just finished number 21 and sent that in.
Excellent.
So
you preempted my final question, right? Okay.
well, it's a little different, so I'll tell you about that later.
Oh, okay.
But no, I had no idea at the time. I thought I was somebody who knew about World War II, and I thought, oh, it's got to be 6, 7, 8 books here. But as I went through it and started learning more and more, things just popped out.
Look, front row fodder has arrived. All right, ladies, you can't escape it. Thank you very much for coming. I was chastising all the people who'd avoided the front row, so we appreciate your filling it in. Anyway, sorry. So you thought that maybe World War II would provide you with enough material for 6 or 7 books, not 20.
Well, 20 and counting.
Right.
So,
and we're still in 1944? Or we moved on to 45?
1945 now. And I just had no idea. Seriously, I thought I knew a lot about the war. But as I started doing research and coming up with different ideas, each one led to another one. And I was astounded at the things I didn't know about and happy to have a chance to make a mystery around them. And it seems to the story keeps being told because there are still things I'm finding out that I didn't know about, and they make apparently for interesting reading.
So you started out with Billy and gave him what I have to tell you, frankly, I thought was sort of a cheesy affiliation with General Eisenhower in Book One. I was almost not going to read it because I thought, oh, come on, really? Some short-tail relative of General Eisenhower, and he's going to do this? But as we've gone on, Billy is an independent person, but you've acquired other cast members that you've been bringing along, and now your challenge in part is to find a place to put Kaz, a place to put Big Mike, occasionally Diana, and it's a whole kind of an ensemble now.
There is a cast of characters, and one of the things that is a little tricky is to give them all stage time, so that because there are some readers who, if I don't have Big Mike in a book, I start getting emails like, what happened? Is he okay? So stage managing multiple secondary characters can be challenging. And as far as Kaz and the others go, they're on their own path. And Kaz is Polish. So what's going to happen to him when the war ends and the Soviet Union has taken over Poland and Great Britain doesn't want the Poles there anymore? What's going to happen to Diana and the Special Operations Executive? What kind of missions is she going to be going on now that at this point in the war, most of occupied Europe has been liberated, except for Germany. So they all have their own pathways in what would be their real lives if they were real people.
Right. So, well, one possible diversion is to send them back to the Pacific because that war went on longer. But, preparing for the piece, we were talking at dinner because dinner is part of the reason authors come here. You think it's you, but it's actually dinner.
It was a good dinner.
Yeah, right. One of the things I was talking to him about, for example, is the Monument Men. And, the preparation for everybody knew that the Nazis had looted an astonishing array They were going to, quote, create a Hitler museum, or they were just going to be greedy and whatever. Um, and so, two questions: how are they going to find all this stuff and liberate it? And the other question was, what if the Russians got there first?
Right, and the Russians were looking for it, but they were probably more interested in whatever nuclear secrets the Germans had. They wanted to steal artwork, but there was also a lot of gold
Right.
hidden in the Mercur's mines, where the Germans hid a lot of the
Yeah.
artwork that was finally found. There was also a lot of gold, but there's that, and then there's a pursuit of whatever nuclear research the Germans managed to get, because the Russians were as interested in that or more so than artwork.
Right. So, in other words, we've gotten to the point where the Allies, despite the terrible attrition of D Day and then moving into occupied France and eventually Germany, can't anticipate winning the war by now in 1945. And so there are all these questions. I mean, I don't know if any of you read Joseph Cannon. If you haven't, I highly recommend him. And he wrote a book called Istanbul Passage, one of my all time favorite. Um, you could call them spy, they're in the espionage realm, but more than that. But that book centers around I think he's American. You remember this, sir? American stationed in Istanbul. Right. And the war suddenly stopped. And there he was in Istanbul. And there was like no extraction plan for him. There was no post war, what do I do when the treaty is signed if I'm stuck in Istanbul? And I've been there. My whole life is in disarray. And, what were the consequences? And that happened to an enormous number of people who, had been taken to war theaters, the whole bit. And then suddenly, there they are. The war is over, and who's now going to be responsible for them?
Right, and the a lot of displaced people came about because the Germans just would not stop fighting.
Right.
Any reasonable government would have taken a look at where they were in early 1945 and conclude that they were defeated. Their armies had been defeated, they were blockaded, their cities were being bombed, but because they were fanatics and because everybody obeyed the fanatics, the army kept on fighting and incurring casualties. And I think that's something that will be addressed in the coming books, is that sense of why won't they just give up? They should be giving up. They're going to be defeated.
Well, your
They
last
know it. We
book-
know it.
Yeah.
But they're still taking lives.
One of the worst battles of the war was a part of your last book, where there was that just incomprehensible slaughter for no, as you point out, really no reason at that point. You're right. They should have rolled it up
Right.
and sued for peace, and, but they didn't. Right. So anyway, there are lots of possibilities for other books.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the reasons, if you all have read the whole series or just some of them, I've read obviously the whole series. I'm just fascinated by the multifacets and the multi-locations that we have read about. One of your books about the Vatican, what it was like for Billy to be in the Vatican and how, the Pope is always, there's a lot of debate about what he could, Pius the 12th, I think it is, what he could or could not have done. But, your book made it so apparent that there was like an inch line there between the Germans and the Vatican.
Very little
And at
room
any
to maneuver.
moment, they could have just stepped over it and wiped out the entire, So I didn't even think, in fact, with Billy Boyle, one of the reasons I think I got so interested in your series, I never thought about the Danish court. Now, I have actually been to Narvik, Norway, which is as far north as the Nazis went. And there's a really nifty World War II museum. And we got there by going from Sweden up to Lapland, and then there's a train that goes across to Narvik, Norway. And I'd never really thought about just how far north they went. And then when you're there, and you see what that must have been like for the Norwegians. Or if you go to the Shetlands and you realize that the Shetland bus was there shuttling people from Norway to the Shetlands and back to try to, deal with, I don't remember, refugees, spies, whatever. It was a two-way deal.
I just want to go back to what you said about Eisenhower earlier.
Oh, okay.
Because Yeah, it's a device. Having Billy work for his Uncle Ike is a device, but um, the one thing it's come in handy about it is Billy actually is kind of like a Zelig. He's everywhere, and you wouldn't it wouldn't be believable. I mean, if you think about it, it still isn't believable because he manages to get in every big scrape
And take Kaz and Mike with him. I mean, I
right.
was
Yeah,
interested in how you brought them into the new book, but we won't go there yet.
Um, so having him work under General Eisenhower gives him, that's God Almighty in World War II in Europe. So it gives him a reason to be able to go to all these places. So I think it would have been even a harder stretch if he didn't have that authority above him, familial and military authority to allow him to
Well,
go
that's
everywhere.
very true. But, those of us who read Reacher, for example, know that armies have to have like internal policing. They have to have military police. There are criminals and criminal behavior, actual crimes and murder that go on within the armed forces. So part of the deal is you have to have somebody in the armed forces
Right.
policing the armed forces, and that's really what Billy. I mean, he does wind up in combat, but isn't his job more or less to be sort of policing
Yeah,
things?
it is, and in most cases where he's involved in a battle, it's because he's had to go there in pursuit of a witness or
Right.
to or a suspect, and that brings him into the line of fire.
Yeah, I mean, I thought in your last book you did a really interesting job about the Louvre and particularly the woman who, to a great degree, saved so many of the treasures of the Louvre. How brave she was. So, not everybody is an actual combatant, not out there with a gun,
Right.
or whatever it might happen to be. And I think you've done a great job with that. So what pulls you into any particular theater? Looking back over 20 books, you started, as I've already said, in England with the Danish court, but
Yeah.
how did you sort of meander off into all these other places?
Um, I, I tend to do a lot of reading, as you might expect, on World War II, and I'm looking for that little thing that just stops me in my tracks. That I didn't know that. That's interesting. And for this book, I started wanting to learn more about the electronic warfare that went on in the skies over Germany at night. The British sending their bombers over, trying to defeat the German radar. And I was reading an article, and the word Jonah cropped up. And a Jonah on a ship is an unlucky person, somebody who dooms the ship. And that just struck me like, why are they talking about Jonahs and electronics? And as it turned out, what really drew me into this was that the British used German Jewish refugees. These were young people from families who came over in the 30s. So they grew up in England, but they had native German language skills. And they brought them into the RAF to serve as what they call special operators. And they would be on a bomber doing electronics to jam the signals of the German radar, to spoof the German radar to thinking the bombers were elsewhere, and even to communicate in perfect German and send contradictory orders. And the reason, though, what really struck me, they were called Jonahs because it was only one bomber in each squadron that was equipped with this extra crewman. And he had his own compartment jammed with electronics. And all the other bombers would fly over Germany in radio silence because then they would stand less chance of being spotted. But this plane with the extra crewman, who was Jewish and German, not one of the old English pals, was not only different from the rest of the crew, but he was putting them at great risk because his electronics was it was the equivalent of lighting it up like a Christmas tree. It was sending out signals to disrupt the Germans, but in doing so, it also made them stand out and made them a prime target. So they were called, by the rest of the crewmen, they were called Jonahs because if you were on a ship with them, you stood a better chance of being shot down. And it just struck me as interesting what it must have been like for those. It was hard enough being on a Lancaster because the Royal Air Force bombers had the highest casualty rate of any unit in the war. But then if you add on to that this extra layer of danger, how did the rest of the crewmen react to those guys? And that just started me down this rabbit hole of how did they actually do all this electronic eavesdropping and countermeasures. And oddly enough, that led to, not oddly, that led to finding out about the women, the German Jewish refugees who were women, that they used on the ground to do the same sort of thing, but from a distance. And then when I was reading a website about these women, one of them mentioned her commanding officer, a squadron officer, Conan Doyle. And it turned so that stopped me in my tracks. Who are they talking about here? Jean Conan Doyle was the daughter of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and she was really an intelligence officer in the RAF during World War II. She went on to command Women's Royal Air Force into the 1950s, but she was in charge of one of these groups of women who were doing the same sort of electronic disruption, but also a lot of spoofing. They would get on the frequency and talk to the German pilots and tell them to go somewhere else, and that they would start having arguments with the real Germans on the ground, and the pilots would get terribly confused. The two women would, one in England, one in Germany, would be saying, "No, don't listen to that Englander. They're trying to send you off." And then, so it was almost comic at times. So anyway, I never knew about all that going on. I never knew how well the British in particular used some of the German Jews that had come over to settle in England.
Right, but I mean, we know a lot about Bletchley Park and the Enigma Code, but I don't know that we know as much about the radio transmission and the jamming and the spoofing in actual combat. When we used to go to the Frankfurt Book Fair before we sold Poison Pen Press to Random House back in 2018, we went to a number of German cities, and I was always surprised at how, even to this day, some of the people there were so surprised that anybody came after them. I mean, there was sort of like a collective, I don't even know, denial or something. But I remember one of the churches, a beautiful church, I think it was in Ulm, if I recall. They finally realized that they needed to protect their stained glass, and they had some really beautiful wood carvings. And so they wised up and took them down into the undercroft and, buried them in sand and all the rest of it. But they still seem sort of slightly baffled by why they'd ever had to do that. And there's a famous almshouse village, name which I can't quite recall at the moment, but there was a medieval banker, I think he was like 14th century, that made so much money he set up a set of almshouses where people could live, poor people could live. And I mean, one of the things I remember is this is pre-literate and pre-lighting. So they had to have carvings, kind of like the gargoyles in a church, but each of the doors had to have a unique carving so that people could tell it was their house, because there weren't any street numbers, there wasn't any light, But anyway, they had a movie that you could see there, and the entire thrust of the movie was worrying that the almshouses would be destroyed and being baffled by why anybody would come after them. And I mean, we're talking in the 2000s here. So, I mean, it's not like right after the war. But then I also remember spending a week in Milan, which has an extraordinarily beautiful cathedral, the Duomo. And it's white and it's up on an elevation, and it was like a primo target. And the Milanese apparently had like a giant debate, and their consensus was that rather than try to hide it, they were going to light it. And they were going to make it so visible that they hoped that both the Germans and the Allies would spare it because it was so beautiful. And their strategy worked. They bombed all around it, but nobody actually took out the Duomo. So those were the kinds of individual decisions. I mean, in another city, they might have decided, on a completely different, but because this war was so much in the air, probably the first time, really, that people had to really think about things that hadn't
three-dimensional in a way that has never
yeah,
been.
exactly. And then the communication as well, the electronic. I mean, today everybody's looking for drones, right? They're coming out of the sky and, and if you can jam them. So, I mean, the sort of same things are going on, but this was an earlier version of it. Anyway, that got you going. So, but we're starting out in this book with a murder on the South Coast, where Billy and Diana are getting one of their rare weekends. And Billy wants to see the White Cliffs of Dover, which in my email, for whatever reason in the book news, AI corrected it to hover. I only noticed it later. I hate it when it does some kind of weird autocorrect, thinking, surely she didn't mean Dover. Yes, I did, but and of course I don't really see it because I thought I typed over, so it kind of gets away from it. Anyway. So they are heading towards the White Cliffs of Dover, and they stumble over a dead American.
Right. It's Christmas morning, and Billy has a weekend leave, and Diana has half a day off from an RAF base that's right near the Cliffs of Dover. So they go for a brisk walk along the White Cliffs of Dover, and of course find a body. They never.
You couldn't give them a break. Just let them enjoy Christmas. Take a stroll.
This is their idea of fun.
You could have at least found the body at the bottom of the cliffs instead of before they got there. But anyway, so he's a dead American, and that
it's
seems
an American Air Force officer. And as Billy is retrieving the body from a precarious position on the cliff, he finds a set of secret diagrams for some of this radio equipment in his pocket. So the question is, who killed him? Why? What was this doing in his pocket? So of course he gets called in to investigate, along with Gene Conan Doyle. So we're only like three people removed from Sherlock Holmes here. So that was very exciting for Billy because he's a big fan of Sherlock Holmes.
That was exciting, right? I know. We're not in the Conan Doyle that was looking at fairies in the bottom of the garden, right? We're in the Sherlock Holmes Conan Doyle, right? He had a hard life, that man. I can't really blame him for wanting to find fairies,
right?
But anyway.
But Jean was more common sense than her father. She ran the estate after he died and kept.
Boy, did she!
Intact.
She protected copyright so vigorously that people like Laurie King could not publish like the Mary Russell books in England until the Jean. Whatever the term of copyright was. I mean, Jean Doyle was like, she was still fighting a war, in defense of, and to be fair, it wasn't for personal gain because, as I recall, all of the revenues for the Sherlock Holmes, it went to a charity. She was the trustee, but it wasn't like she was fighting, for money for herself, but she was, although she was British, so maybe she just wanted to do that thing, regardless of where it went, because they're very big on that kind of thing, right?
Yep.
But have fun for you, right?
So in the same vein as I was talking before about Billy going after a witness or a suspect, leading him into danger, it turns out that there is a witness to something that happened that would explain who the murderer was, but that was one of these special operators, and his Lancaster has just been shot down over Germany. And this fellow was based on a real person, a German refugee who decided, came and wanted to join the RAF, was one of these radio operators, and he decided he was not going to be taken prisoner. He flew every mission with a set of hiking boots strapped around his neck because they flew in these heavy leather fleece-lined boots that would be no good at all for running away from the Gestapo in occupied Europe. So this fellow was adamant that he was not going to be captured, and it turns out through some radio intercepts that Diana and Gene Conan Doyle have a role in, they discover where he's headed, and he's merging into what was the largest air rescue of American air crew in history. We had a lot of downed air crew pilots and air crew in Yugoslavia because our bombers were flying from Italy to Romania and back and forth. And they were bailing out over Yugoslavia as their crippled planes went down. And the Serbian partisans and Tito's partisans helped get them out. But at one point, there were so many, our OSS had to mount a rescue operation and have airfields built in the mountains to land transport planes to get them out. Again, something that I had never known about. So Billy's job is to go into Yugoslavia to ensure this witness gets out, because he's very important in terms of whether or not there's a spy on the base and whatever. So it's another case of Billy's got to go find a witness, and that witness, of course, is going to be in the most dangerous position I can possibly create for him.
Of course he was. So they were flying. It was Romania was a big oil source, right, for the
Yes,
German.
yep,
I learned that from Alan First, who, if you've never read Alan First, marvelous espionage novels. But I hadn't really thought about, excuse me, the value of Bulgaria and Romania, but Romania in particular was a rich oil field, and the Nazi war machine needed oil. They didn't actually have a lot of natural oil in Germany, right?
Or none. They were
Or
big
none?
into synthetic oil,
Right.
but they took what they could from Romania.
Sure. So I asked Jim at dinner if he'd actually been to Yugoslavia, now mostly known as Croatia. And I'm sorry to say that he hasn't. I have, and it's absolutely beautiful. But since I was a child when the war ended, and I was actually growing up, I remember how suspicious we all were of Marshal Tito and wondering how long that kind of unlikely grouping of countries that had been at war forever, because they were so incredibly tribal and had different religions, as we found out in the Bosnian War, how long that would all hold up.
Until Tito died.
That's right. And then it kind of splintered. See, I have a theory that cults don't outlive the death of the leader. If you really look back over history, you will see that most of the time, if somebody is able to attract a cult, it generally disintegrates whenever that personality is removed from the scene. So Tito was one of those really powerful personalities, and somehow he managed to hold together this kind of
And some of
alliance.
his success was due to the fact that the British backed him,
Yeah.
mainly because a lot of the British agents who were working there were spies for the Soviets. So Kim Philby, when he was sent to Yugoslavia to decide who are we going to support out of all the guerrilla factions, he of course chose Tito because that was Stalin's pick. So
Well, I mean, there was already a lot of fear about what communist Russia would be doing post-war.
Right.
You know, as I say, a lot of you've really reached the point where people have to be considering what comes next in the stories. But you know, that's a theater hardly anybody, you and Alan First so far, really go to. So, you know, why did you decide on Yugoslavia? Because you could probably have focused on another country where they could have been flying.
I came across this rescue operation, which took place mostly in Serbia, and without getting into factionalism, that was a different faction. That was General Milojevic, and he was Serbian. Tito was more, if you're everybody in Yugoslavia, as long as you're communist, and the Serbians were more on the side of the king of Yugoslavia, King Peter, but they lost out in the end. And even though they spent a lot of time and effort and lost a lot of lives saving our air crew, we betrayed them at the end of the war. So it was just an interesting mix of cultures and politics and betrayal, which makes for interesting reading.
Tribalism was responsible for many ills in the world. We're seeing it all over again right now. But
there was one group, the Croatian Ustasi, were so horrific that even the German SS didn't like working with them. So that tells you something about how bad they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were
an interesting mix of people.
Well, there were some really good spy novels written after the war by people like Martha Albrand. These are probably names you guys never even, but my mother loved that stuff, so I read them all. And yeah, they spent a lot of time in those war theaters, or the aftermath of it. Even Mary Stuart and My Brother Michael, if I remember right, there's still stuff going on from the war in Greece. And, very old sins. There were people who behaved badly in the war that got away with it, but then the question was, were they going to get caught,
Right.
in the peace sometime later? So the implications of it. And you're really only dealing with half the war theater. I mean, it was pretty awful over there in
Yeah.
China and Japan and
Sure.
India and Burma and all the rest of it. Although Thailand was kind of like the Asian Sweden and stayed neutral.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You don't hear much about them in the war.
No, you don't. And I remember going to Burma in 2012. We were on like the first river cruise down the Irrawaddy. And it still has all the scars of war. They rejected the British but the problem was they didn't know how to do any of the stuff that the British actually operated. For example, the post office or the railroads or the countries that got rid of the colonialists but kept the infrastructure fared better. But the Burmese didn't do that. And I've never been entirely clear. I'm not entirely clear what the Burmese are doing, all this time later. But they're a society that I don't think has ever really recovered from colonial in the war. I had an uncle that was stationed at what was called the Hump, which was for the Burma Road. I think was flying people from India, wasn't it, over the Himalayas and. And I wish people didn't talk about it. People that served in World War II, they never talked about it. He didn't come home and tell us war stories. And I was too young, really, to ask him about, what he did and what it was like. And I think there probably is some good oral history out there, but I haven't paid attention to it. Have you found that to be a useful research tool?
In terms of talking about it?
Well, oral histories.
Yeah.
Or are there that many?
Well, the Farley, no, I'm getting it wrong. Quartered Safe Out Here is a great book about the campaign in Burma by a famous writer whose name is escaping me at the moment. But actually recorded oral histories, no, I haven't come across that.
Well, it's hard not to think of Alec Guinness and the Bridge on the River Kwai, which is an absolutely astonishing movie. But I don't know that we have a lot of material about. I was just surprised at how poor Burma was and how much they had rejected, or not rejected, but just. Yeah, they did. I guess that really is the word. Rejected whatever possible infrastructure benefits and so forth that had come their way, and there they were. And there they still are, as far as I can work out. They haven't really moved on from that. Whereas India kept the railroads and all kinds of things, and despite the awful effects of partitioning India. I was saying to Jim, what were the British thinking when they decided to partition India after the war? I mean, this was a multicultural and multi-religious society where they'd all lived side by side and all. And the minute you start drawing lines and encourage people to be tribal, it goes to mayhem. And I thought, why didn't the British just leave? I mean, I don't know. I can't answer. I mean, where's Churchill and Mountbatten? We can't really ask them those questions. But what a terrible thing. But you're not going to write about that. No, wrong theater. Right. So Diana and her family, a couple books back, you wrote an absolutely cracking murder mystery about a downed plane near the Seton Estate. That was one of my very favorite Billy Boyles. Do you all remember reading that? I mean, wasn't that was just like a classic British mystery in so many ways.
It was fun to take a little break, and I'm a big fan of Dorothy L. Sayers as well as Agatha Christie. So it was set in Dorothy L. Sayers' backyard. Right. So it was a lot of fun to write.
But so we still have Diana, her family, in this book, she's still
involved. So.
Yeah.
The next book, it's just Billy and Kaz, and I decided, somebody said, or you started off by saying, can't you give him a break? Can't Billy get a break? So the next book, Billy and Kaz are going to the tropics. They're going to Cuba to chase Nazi spies in the company of Ian Fleming, who the more I read about Ian Fleming, he was just really a disagreeable, dislikable person. He was a drunk, a womanizer. I mean, really. He wrote great stories, but he
Well, I
did
don't
some
know.
good
There's
things.
not a lot of difference there with James Bond. Come on. Here's a
He drank a quart of gin a day.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, he died young.
well, no kidding.
Yeah, he did. He did. He was
He
one of
smoked like a
those.
chimney.
He was one of those British public school guys that he really belonged in the 19th century. He was the kind of guy that should have been like sent out to Africa or
Right.
something. He
Yeah.
he was in the wrong century for
Right.
who he was and his background.
And he was always chasing his older brother, Peter.
Right.
Peter was better looking. He was more of a combat soldier. And he had already published a book before the war. And the three things that Ian wanted to do was publish a book, be in combat, and be better looking to attract more women.
And he
so-
only had a shot at two of them. Still,
So
right.
he finally turned his wartime experiences into the Bond novels, which he talked about during the whole war.
Right.
doing.
But if he hadn't written them, nobody would even remember him.
Right.
It's surprising how a literary legacy can make people, if not immortal, at least live on.
Right.
Whereas there were many heroes and better people that we don't even know about or ever think about.
Well, he hit on a great formula because he created a British superhero at a time when the British Empire was going down in decline. So he was somebody that everybody could, because Felix Leiter, his sidekick, his American sidekick, was secondary, and that was turning the real world on its head. So it was interesting that you can see why it took off the way it did. But it was just, I can't say he was my hero, but I enjoyed the Bond books and the movies. But reading about him, it was just a little disreputable.
It was.
It makes for an interesting character.
It was. But, you really raised a good point. I mean, Britain, at the end, did lose the war.
Yeah.
Actually, World War I is what did for them. And, right. But that economy where you had to import everything, you couldn't actually grow enough food or do enough at home in your own territory was so vulnerable once all this. We sort of learned that during COVID, when so many of our supply lines were cut off. But Britain couldn't even feed itself. I mean, they stayed on rationing until, what was it, 52 or 53. And one reason many of them our age have absolutely appalling teeth is because they didn't get, they had no milk or no source of calcium or so forth. So you can kind of tell how old many British people are just by looking at their teeth. Right. An unhappy thought. Well, we should do something more glamorous here. Right. So anyway, Diana is involved in this book with Jean Conan Doyle.
Well, and I did have to find another job for her because
Right.
the special operations executive was really running out of places to go. It was much too dangerous to parachute into Germany, and all the other countries were being slowly freed.
Right.
So she is given an assignment to work in this radio interception program because of her Italian language skills, especially.
So what are you going to do with her when Billy goes off to Cuba?
Well, she's not in this next book. It's
Oh,
really a Billy and Kaz show.
Okay, so we don't know what she's up to while he's
No,
gone.
she's got her kid sister, who in this book, so Angelica, if you follow the series, Kaz's, not Diana's.
No, Kaz's sister.
Kaz's kid sister has been rescued from Ravensbrück concentration camp in an exchange of prisoners, and she is being nursed back to health, but she enters this group of radio intercept people and becomes part of that group. So she's sort of another hanger-on. I've got now a young woman who's part of this group. So we'll have to find a way to bring her into the fold more fully.
So you're creeping along towards the end of the war. Do you intend to write post-war, or do you think when the war comes that maybe that's it?
No, I think Billy is just going to have to live his life, and he's going to have to decide what he wants to do. That's how I look at it.
Stay in England,
And
right?
I think he's going to want to continue the whole thing about the Nuremberg
Yeah.
war crime trials is very interesting. I think that might be something he would naturally want to stay around for. So I want it to be organic to his character, that he just doesn't, get ordered to stay, but it'll be a choice he makes. And the way I approach the end of the war, it's kind of fluid. I've got lots of ideas to take us up to the actual end of the war and then beyond. But
Right.
it'll have to be natural for him. And I literally don't know where Kaz will end up, because he's going to have trouble finding a homeland. So
Right. Well, the end of the war wasn't the end for so many people,
Yeah.
lives that were disrupted,
Mhm.
as we've said. Do you want to ask questions? I'm going to cough. Do you want to ask questions from the audience? Excuse me.
I'm sorry. Asking questions?
Questions.
Questions. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Well, I think about that all the time. But there was a producer, NCIS Hawaii, I think it's off the air now, but anyway, the fellow who was the executive producer of that did write a script and did get a meeting at Netflix, but nothing came of it. So, there are people who are trying, but there are people who know a lot more about Hollywood than I do who are trying, so we'll see. Historicals are very expensive to make, and one of the feedback we got from the Netflix people is that the demographic that these books appeal to is not necessarily their demographic.
In other words, older people. Right. Right.
So, but
On the other
there's
hand,
still
how
possibilities.
Yeah, but it would be wonderful if younger people could actually learn this history.
Well,
I mean, one of the reasons we get into these messes is that people forget what already, what always come back to this, that, we're talking about the war. What was Hitler thinking when he went to Russia? Didn't he ever read about Napoleon? I mean, it was just like right there in front of him. And the other question is, what was he going to do with it? I mean, Napoleon, was he going to govern Russia from Paris? Was Hitler seriously going to govern Russia from Berlin? I mean, I think people who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it as the sort of standard thing. But I think it would be wonderful if many of the things that are points and themes that are made in your books were to become apparent to a younger generation who have absolutely no clue. I even ran into a guide in Berlin somewhere in the early aughts here who had no idea what Checkpoint Charlie was. I mean, he took us there, but he didn't understand, what it was all about. And I thought, wow, it was like 50 some years. And, he had literally no idea why people wanted to see Checkpoint Charlie. Well, actually, it wasn't even that, because Checkpoint Charlie was 1990, really, with Glasnost, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, so not even all the way back to the war. Wow. So we could hope. I saw another hand come up. No?
Yes, sir.
You, one thing I like about your books is you put some humorous, clever little anecdotes in them. My favorite is Billy Boyle being asked by a German officer to give last rites to a soldier. It was in the Vatican book.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Is that something you just do naturally, or is that, how do you get the humor in there?
Could you repeat sort of the question?
The question was, how do you get humor into these books? And I have to sort of take things lightly every now and then, just because it's kind of a downer sometimes to be writing about all this death and horror. And I think Billy's attitude comes from a part of my brain that's a real wise ass, and I don't usually let it out because I would get in trouble, but when I'm writing Billy, that's anything goes, and I think it's sort of a release to be able to do that. But it also takes time. I mean, when he says something, when he throws off a one-liner, that could be a half hour of me working on it to make him sound good.
Right, but you have to have your own sense of humor in order to give him one.
Yeah.
If you were a basically humorless, boring person, so would Billy be, right?
Right.
Although I have met some writers where maybe that totally contradicts that statement, but still. Right. Anyone else have a question? Patrick, are there any online questions? Sorry. Strange noises emitted.
There was a question from somebody about, if you could go back to this era yourself, what role would you play? What would you do?
You know what? I used to work as a newspaper reporter, and I think being a war correspondent, although dangerous, would be exciting and it would be interesting to be at the heart of some of these events in the way these books are, but as an observer and a recorder. So a war correspondent would be.
There sure were some great ones, too.
Yeah.
Male and female. Yeah, there were some women who did some really kick-ass stuff during the war.
Liebling, A.J. Liebling.
Right.
Martha Gellhorn.
Yeah.
Hemingway kept marrying them, so kind of reduced the population. But still, no, there was some astonishing reporting during the war. But that's how we used to get our news in the newspapers. Or do any of you remember when they used to have the black and white, the Path of the News before the? I mean, I used to, we used to go to the movies like every Saturday in Winnetka. Our community house had a for 20 cents, or maybe it was a quarter. We could do that, and it always started out with the I think it was RKO, wasn't it? RKO, Path of the News, and and it was. We were enjoying it as a group, not sitting at home, spread out and dispersed with our television sets. We used to get news in a much more of a community fashion than we do now, and I think maybe that created a lot more unity than the way we happens today. Anybody else? Oh, well, in that case, let's congratulate Jim on book 20. Yay!
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, and
Thanks
if you
for having me.
Oh, always a pleasure. It's one of my treats every year. So if you all would like to get a book signed or take photos or something, now's your chance.